The battery died where the road narrowed, and the dust hung like a held breath. Jacob had been 3 hours late already. The workshop would be a furnace by noon, the men waiting with cigarette smoke and blunt questions about parts and pay. He knew every stubborn noise the old Toyota made, its coughs, its small betrayals. But he did not know how to make time stretch for school fees or for the cough that had settled in Helen's chest last month. He turned the key, felt the click, and then nothing. The starter had given up a long time ago on generosity. The driver sitting on the curb beside him cursed softly under his breath, more at circumstance than at the car. Lagos had a way of showing you its teeth without warning. A pothole the size of a modest room, a convoy of horn-blaring Danfos that insisted on ownership of the air. A woman in a cream suit had stopped, because she could, because the world around her had lanes marked by money, and she could step out of them. She arranged a scarf around her neck, even as she climbed from the car, breath held against the heat that made the air shimmer over tar. He would later remember the way she moved, deliberate, quiet, like someone used to being given space and having it cleared for them. Her hair was silver, like the coins he'd never seen outside envelopes. Her hands were manicured, and, for a moment, brief and luminous, rested on the hood as if testing the car's pulse. When she spoke his name, she had read the card he had placed on the windshield for customers. Her voice matched the register of someone unaccustomed to being refused. "Battery dead?" she asked. "Yes, Ma," Jacob said. The Ma automatic, the respect his mother had taught him at elbows and in prayer. There was oil under his nails that would not come out with soap. The skin along his palms was a map of small cuts. He used his wrist to check the paperwork attached to the window, and, for a ridiculous moment, considered pretending he knew more than he did. She smiled something that was not the same as kind. From her purse she produced a business card with a logo that said Somerset Holdings, a place name that suggested marble and nights where the sheets never stuck to skin in Lagos humidity. The card was an invitation that carried no obligation and all the weight of possibility. "Alhaji Musa sent me this," she said, dropping the name like a coin into the conversation. "He said you are patient." Jacob laughed because patience was cheaper than rent and he had practiced it for years. "I try, Ma," he said. She watched him like a woman watching a small, slow animal. "Come to the house this evening. I would like someone who understands engines to look at my car often. You will be paid." The word paid rearranged the room. It had the taste of thick honey in his mouth, something he had not had in years. He imagined not paying half at the end of the month, the school fees slipping into his hands like paper birds, no longer needing to fly. "Thank you, Ma," Jacob said, and he meant it with the devotion of a man who had more to give than the world often received. That evening, Jacob's hands smelled of oil and heat, and the memory of polished wood and marble that did not belong to him. He took the route he always told himself he would not take, the long way that passed the river and the cheap cafes where young men argued football scores like it was theology. He arrived at a compound that seemed to have no understanding of the word hurry. Wide gates opened by a man who doubled his smile for strangers, a driveway where peacocks would have looked ordinary, and a house that suggested walls that had never known the dirt that found his soles every day. Amanda Somerset met him at the door in a dressing gown the color of cream milk. She was older than the men who had taught Jacob to fix brakes. She was 65 and old enough to have watched Lagos move from something private to something greedier. Her age seemed to hang around her like a soft shawl, an adornment rather than a limitation. There were lines at the corners of her eyes that told of laughter more than sorrow. Those lines softened Jacob's tendency to put people into boxes. "Alhaji recommended you," she said, and led him through the air-conditioned cool into a garage that smiled at him with the kind of light that did not come from bulbs but from decisions. There were tools he recognized and others he did not, a mechanic's language translated into other people's currency. She talked about the car as though it were a temperamental friend, She talked about nothing that mattered and everything that did. She paid him with envelopes on a schedule that made his own pockets laugh with relief. But it was not the money that held him. It was the way she listened. While he talked about pistons and the stubbornness of a carburetor, her attention was an absent thing in his life, a light that could settle on his smallness and enlarge it. When the first payments arrived neatly folded and precise, Mariam frowned at the table. Mariam had a way about her that refused to be softened by generosity. She read charity as a ledger with interest. Their daughter Helen, 8, practiced small miracles in a corner, singing the same cartoon song over and over until it became a prayer. "He is not a man who takes presents and forgets them," Mariam said. "We work, we sweat, we feed the children with our hands. We do not take ourselves to be gifts." Jacob loved Mariam the way a man loves a household that makes him less lonely. She had lines he knew and accepted. She placed food on the table with the same hands that tied Helen's braids, and when she met the envelopes, she did not look at the total so much as at the smallness of the exchange, a charity that could become dependence. "No debt should be owed to someone who might one day ask for a favor we cannot repay," she said. Jacob understood both the payment and the danger. He told Mariam that this was work, that he would return every naira ledgered back into the household. He did not tell her about the way Amanda's eyes seemed to look for him in rooms full of options, or about the evenings when she called and asked for the sound of his voice in the languor of the night. He did not tell her that being paid with envelopes made him proud in a way salaries in his town had never had the power to do. There are gaps in people where silence has been stored, and those gaps can be filled. For Amanda, who had loved and lost in ways the city learned to conceal, the gap had been a long, empty room. Wealth had given her privacy and proximity to danger in equal measure. She ran companies that bent entire neighborhoods into new shapes. She had sons who loved her, as sons love their mothers, with the distant reverence reserved for figures on high. She had a sister, Amarka, who showed every day what dependence looked like when the same hands that once arranged hair now asked for help. The first real closeness between Amanda and Jacob happened small and without flourish. She called wanting the car moved at small hours, and he went because it was money and because her voice sounded like a hand that smoothed the crease. One winterless Lagos evening, under the hum of generator and the whisper of the pool's filtration, conversation opened as doors sometimes do, a knock of familiarity that allowed a stranger to see the interior. He told her, without the poetry her life could have afforded, about Helen's cough that would not leave, about Miriam's hands that had started developing small tremors when she stirred the pot after a long day. Amanda listened and paid attention with a hunger that was both business and something more human. She began to bring soup sometimes, warmer than the envelopes, the kind that remembered what bone-deep hunger tasted like. She started inviting him to the house when her sons were away, meetings, she said. Jacob started to taste a life where hunger was a rumor rather than a daily weather report. "It is not charity," Amanda said one night, sitting with him on a chair that did not complain under the weight of his knees. "I do not like seeing good people suffer." Jacob thought of his father, of a man who would not ask a neighbor for a cup of sugar, even when the sack on his own shelf had been long gone. "No, Ma," he said, "you do not have to, but thank you." Words between them became small confidences. He fixed the cars that ran like doctors at the hospital of her life. She insisted on paying in ways that made him feel like a professional rather than an errand boy. There was a business card between them at first, a symbol of exchange, then envelopes, then messages that paused the light. The city, which loved to pair unlikely things, settled them into a rhythm both dangerous and tender. It was not sudden when the barrier between gratitude and something else crumbled. The hours grew into a pattern. The car, the calls, the dinner. Late one night, after a storm that left the air smelling of wet dust and green things, Amanda invited him to sit by the pool. The water shimmered like dark glass. She poured tea into a cup and handed it to him with fingers that trembled only slightly. "Do you ever regret your choices?" she asked. Jacob held the cup, a hot thing that steamed against his palms, the clay more honest than his skin. He thought of Miriam's quiet insistences, of Helen's laughter like a bell, of the school fees stacking like small immovable things. "Yes," he said, and the tea hummed in his mouth. "Every time I see the bills." Amanda's laugh was soft and private. She had grown used to people offering explanations for suffering, and to the patience of others who thought suffering a test of character, rather than the blunt reality of a city. "I think regret always has company," she said. "Sometimes it's the thing that tells you you've lived." They kissed in the damp air, tentative as a bridge built across a river whose current they both underestimated. It was not a cinematic encounter with thunder and vows. It was a small, private collapse. Jacob felt the tug of shame like a string pulled across a board. He thought of Miriam and of Helen asleep under a mosquito net that smelled faintly of citronella. He thought of the envelopes she would take in her hands and place on the table. He thought of pride, what it costs and what it saves. Neither of them could say, when they closed the door behind them, that the act had all the weight of surrender. For Amanda, it was the first time in years someone had touched her without measurement or contract. For Jacob, it was an opening, a way to breathe that was not scandal but survival. For both, there was a sense of rescue that the world would call by other names. Rumors are efficient engines in Lagos. They move faster than buses and with less respect for privacy. Amanda's sons of a woman who had had to teach them to take nothing for granted, began to notice small inconsistencies. A mechanic's card on the kitchen counter, a cup with the residue of engine grease near the sink. They watched their mother with the suspicion of those who read the world as ledger and loss. Amanda told them the truth partially, wedged in with the protective habit of mothers who know how to blunt an incoming spear. "I am lonely in ways money cannot fix," she said to her eldest one evening, and the talk ended there because some confessions carry the weight of inevitable consequence. The sons shuffled like ambassadors among their own grievances. They loved their mother, but they loved the idea of their family more. That image of control, of dignity that wealth had given them. The idea of a man from the other side of the city's dust line becoming an occupying force in their mother's life did not sit well. The affair continued in a slow, secretive tempo. Jacob stole hours like a thief takes breath, wrenching, working, returning to the house he had not meant to surrender. He sent part of Amanda's envelopes to pay a debt he had kept hidden from Miriam, and he watched as the relief in their home steadied against the pattern of their hunger. He looked at Helen and thought of permanence, of the way children believe the world will never change. He felt like a man racing to patch something that might tear no matter what hands he used. When Amanda discovered she was pregnant, it was a small chaos. A heartbeat in a sterile room, a clip of sound on a machine that made the air thinner. She had not expected this. At 65, pregnancy felt like an implausible, almost irreverent miracle. There were logistical questions, doctors, tests, the whisper of medical risk. Yet those were less urgent than the emotional avalanche. She had imagined inheritance planning, a will revised, perhaps a grandchild somewhere down the line. She had not imagined the arrival of a child carried in her own body, with the potential to reconfigure everything she had thought permanent. Jacob learned of the pregnancy in the same way a man learns that a storm is coming, small signs that build into a certainty. Amanda called him trembling in the late hours, her voice a cracked bell. "They said there's a heartbeat," she told him, and in the way she spoke he heard a language he had never learned to read. Joy and terror braided together into an urgency that reshaped the contours of his days. He felt triumphant and guilty in the same breath. When he told Miriam, he watched her face fold into a shape he could not read. She was practical. She demanded proofs and details and had no patience for the sorrows of strangers. "This is not our child," she said, but her voice carried more than anger. It carried the fright of a woman who had built a life on the faith that she and her husband would be sufficient. What will people say? What will Helen think? Helen came to the argument with the blunt compassion of a child who had already decided what was right and wrong. She took Amanda's hand the first time she saw her after the news and plucked at the hem of the older woman's sleeve like someone making sure the fabric held. "Are you scared?" the girl asked, and Amanda tightened her fingers around Helen's smallness with an answer that was both yes and not terribly. The city did not keep secrets. Whispers are currency there, and the son's friends practiced that trade with cheerful disregard. Amarka heard. She heard in the way the house shifted and the way the servants' steps became lighter, in the way Amanda's gestures acquired a softness that was resented and feared in equal measure. Amarka had been a twin once, one body split into two lives that diverged as sometimes happens when one person learns to take and another learns to give. She had arrangements built on the brittle dependence of a woman who expected handouts from a sister whose resources had become a public spectacle. The pregnancy, to her, looked like a reallocation of attention and of household resources. She began to shadow the corners of Amanda's generosity with questions that had teeth. Why give this man envelopes? What is he to you? Her voice was practiced in accusation, which is another way of saying she fed on fear. "You will lose everything for a man from the other side of town," she said in a tone that mixed counsel with something more dangerous. Amanda, who had been used to calls that carried subtle agendas, met Amarka's attack with a firmness that surprised both of them. "I am not losing anything," she said. "I am gaining a life that I have desired in silence." It was a line drawn in a compound that had rarely seen combat, and yet the air felt like a battlefield because it always had to when family rearranged itself. Jacob watched from the periphery as the house tightened its circle. He loved Amanda with a fierce, complicated devotion and feared the consequences. He loved Mariam with the steadiness of the household and feared losing that steadiness. He loved Helen with a reckless, protective kind of affection that made him consider choices he would have before called cowardly. There was no simple arithmetic that could satisfy these competing equations. One night, after Amanda had spent an afternoon knitting small blankets she thought the child would like, Jacob sat with his hands in his lap and watched her from across a table that had more room than the life he had known. She placed her fingers over his and said without drama, "If this child comes into the world, I will not let anyone take it from me." He wanted to answer with the kind of promise that would be both foolish and heroic. Instead, he nodded, because promises were currencies he had little of, and yet many of us spend. Rumors, once more, began to wrap themselves around their lives. Someone left us a note at the workshop that suggested impropriety. A driver who had once been Amanda's guard watched Jacob with a patience that was less about kindness than inventory. The small things multiplied. A photograph taken for reasons no one could explain. A neighbor's tongue that found freedom in scandal. Mariam's suspicion hardened into a certain coldness Jacob could not thaw with envelopes or confessions. "Go home," she said one night, and the house felt smaller for the words. There was language of a household betrayed that stung like salted sugar. He could have chosen transparency, tell Mariam everything, expose the threads, but there is a kind of shame that acts like a net, and it had trapped him. He thought of Helen's future, of the way society loved to brand men who had stepped beyond the lines drawn by poverty. He weighed his dignity against his shame and found both wanting. At the same time, the household in which Amanda had been raised tightened like a fist. Amarka's resentment grew into something more tactile. A door slammed in a corridor, a cup forgotten on the side table with darker residue near its rim. Small things acquired weight when placed in the right hands. The sister, once a shadow in Amanda's life, began to move through rooms with an intent that made servants avert their eyes. "She will not take what is mine," Amarka whispered to a friend in the servants' quarters, and the friend nodded, because fear is a contagious thing. Jacob began to notice the cup of tea more often, how Amanda would take a sip and then hesitate, how Amarka would be present with a smile that did not reach her eyes. He began to think of tea as a vessel not just of warmth but of trust. Tea was a thing you accepted from someone only when hands were honest. One evening, when the moon arranged itself like an afterthought over Lagos, Jacob found himself standing outside Amanda's bedroom door while voices moved inside like careful birds. He could have left. He did not. He did not leave because the child inside her had become, in a way, a thing he found himself defending without understanding fully why. He had not planned to be the father of a child born to a woman his society called out of his reach. He had not planned that his own hands, oil-stained and adept at mending dents, would someday cradle an infant who might have a silver curl like Amanda's or his own stubborn jaw. But planning is another luxury. Outside the house, the city hummed. Inside, choices were being made with the visible and the invisible. Jacob put his hand flat against the cool metal gate and imagined a future where his daughter Helen could walk into a school without the fear of being turned away for ragged shoes. He imagined Amanda's sons learning what humility might look like if offered with courtesy. He imagined Amarca's face softening when attention was redistributed. He did not.
Imagine the lengths someone could go to preserve what they saw as theirs. In the kitchen, as he left that night, a cup steam curled into his lungs, and he tasted not only tea, but a tang of something else, metallic, bright. For a breath, he thought his mind, tired and worried, had made the association: tea, trust, treachery. He brushed it aside, because the mind does strange things when overloaded with fear. By dawn, the house wore the thin mask of routine. The guards stood at the gate as always. Cars arrived in their ordained order. A driver swept the driveway with a broom that had not seen debt and therefore did not know the weight of it. Jacob took his envelope to Mariam and listened to her count the bills in silence. Helen came running with a drawing of a small family beneath a big sun and presented it to him with the fierce belief that art could hold the world together. "You will come home early tonight?" Helen asked, eyes bright. "I will try," Jacob said, and meant it with a softer desperation than he had intended to admit. He went to the compound because the life he now lived at two ends of Lagos had become a rope stretched taut. When he arrived, he saw Amarca sweeping, moving with an economy that suggested she had found a purpose. She looked at him, and her eyes were full of something like apology, or perhaps of calculation. He could not tell. Later, when the servant found Amanda asleep on her chair by the pool, clutching a small blanket she had knitted with knitting needles that had belonged to a woman in another era, there was a cup beside her with a faint ring of residue. The house moved as if relieved that the morning had not burst into scandal. For a moment, the city felt like a place where things could be contained. Amarca, however, had learned to move in the room with the patience of someone who had watched advantage walk away from her for years. She had reasons, she thought, reasons that smelled like hunger and were dressed up as fear. She thought about a life where she had been the lesser half of a pair, the woman who had to ask for what others received by right. She thought, in a dangerous hush, about the way a single cup could rearrange a family forever. When the servant asked for tea, Amarca volunteered and smiled with the kind of casualness that sometimes preludes catastrophe. She moved with an ordinary grace, hands practiced at serving, and the cup was placed where it had always been placed, on the side table, its surface reflecting a broken sky. Jacob, returning later, saw the cup, and something in him recoiled. It was a small thing, but that is how many things worth noticing appear, small, and then suddenly carrying the whole world. He reached for it and felt the handle cool and steady. He did not know then what the next minutes would require of him. He knew only that trust had the weight of a cup, and that sometimes trust can be given away like coins. Outside, Lagos continued its blunt, tireless work of living. Inside, the family moved like a set of pieces that had always been designed for a different game. None of them could see yet the choices that would break and bend them. The air carried the scent of damp dust and petrol and the faint sweetness of Amanda's knitting. Jacob took a sip and, for the first time in days, allowed himself a sense of small, impossible hope.
The child within Amanda, the shifting loyalties, the envelopes on Mariam's table, they were all threads in a fabric he did not know how to weave. But he held the cup as if it might offer an answer. That night, in the workshop, under the weak filament of a lamp, he thought of the business card she had given him months before. He traced the letters with his thumb as if the ink might reveal a map. He thought of Helen's drawing and of school fees, and of the way the city sometimes ate those who tried to step across its invisible lines. He did not know, then, the distance between intention and consequence. He did not know how far fear could travel when given permission to move. He only knew the small, stubborn fact of needing to protect what had come to mean more to him than simple survival. When the message came the next morning, short, measured, and like a door closing, there was no immediate panic. It was a note from Amarka's confidant. "Watch what you hold," it said. Jacob folded the paper and put it back into his pocket like a thing one might regret keeping but could not yet throw away. Later he would wish he had listened to the small alarms, the scratching of a paper against time. He would wish he had taken Helen's request more seriously and come home not late but early, decided by the kind of courage that time rarely asks for until it is too late. But that morning he went back to work, and the city uplifted its relentless business around him. The cup waited on a table across a courtyard of privilege, a small vessel, the kind that could hold a truth and drown it in silence. It was only a cup. It was also the start of everything that would follow. If you want to see what happens next, how the family fractures under truth, whether Amarka's plan will be revealed, and whether Jacob will choose flight or fight, like this story, subscribe to catch the next installment. Tell us in the comments which side you think will stand when the dust settles. Amanda and her unexpected joy, Jacob and the life he must choose, or Mariam and the household she fights to preserve. Jacob came back sooner than he had promised himself he would. The workshop smelled of oil and warm metal. His hands still held the memory of the lamp's thin light when he walked across the courtyard and pushed at the gate. The house was quieter than the city. Even Lagos, which never slept when she was angry, seemed to hold its breath for a moment. He paused on the threshold, watching the cup where it had been left. It sat like a small accusation on the wooden table, a ring of pale residue again catching the light. Mariam's shadow moved in the passage beyond. She was always moving, a permanent current. Helen's laughter, quick and careless, came from upstairs and sounded like a thing that belonged to a different life. "Jacob?" Mariam's voice, measured, called from the kitchen. "You're early." He stepped inside and the floorboards answered. Amarka looked up from the low stove where she was arranging plates. Her face closed into the practiced calm that had saved her from many small catastrophes. In it he read, as he always had, the long mathematics of compromise, the rounding down of desire, the carrying over of money troubles. "You drank from this," he said without prelude, and the words landed like stones in a pool. Amarka's hands did not shake when she set the teapot down. "I served you tea," she said. "You asked for it." "I asked for it because Helen needed the fees," Jacob said. "You told me you would—" He stopped. The message folded in his pocket felt suddenly heavier. He drew it out, unfolded the paper with a thumb that had steadied gun barrels, and now trembled for want of steadiness elsewhere. "Watch what you hold," he read aloud, tasting the words as if they might explain what they meant. Amarka's eyes did not leave his face. "Who sent that?" He watched the color move through her skin, saw a small, almost embarrassed flicker of defeat. "No one I know," he said. "Someone who knows enough to warn." Mariam set a dish on the table with a clack that sounded like an order. She folded a towel and did not look at either of them. "There are letters on my table," she said. "Envelopes. I thought they were charity. They are not." Jacob's voice grew softer by degrees. "Envelopes?" "Paid in cash." Mariam's hand smoothed the towel. "Signed with a name I have seen before." She did not say the name, though Jacob understood that withholding had its own hunger. The room bent toward a silence that might have been mistaken for truce. Helen's footsteps came down the stairs, and she walked into the kitchen with a scrap of paper crumpled in her fist. A school receipt, perhaps, or a drawing. She looked like a promise braced by paper. "What's wrong?" she asked, because the air was wrong, and children know these things before adults do. Jacob could have softened then. He could have folded the note and put it back into his pocket, and told a lie approved by love. Instead, the line of fear that had been tightening inside him snapped into something like clarity. He told them about the cup, about the message. He told them about the business card in his hand at the lamp, and the way the city sometimes threatened to grind people into shapes they did not choose. Amarka listened, and when she spoke close to the truth. "I met someone," she said. "Not the sort you think. Someone who said there was work for Helen, a scholarship, small. He wanted something small in return. I told him where to come." The words fell out like coins. They clinked and were not enough. "Miriam knows this?" Jacob asked. Miriam's mouth tightened. "I know that there are men who leave envelopes for the right hands. I know that some envelopes come with photographs in them, and with threats. I thought those were for women who were learned in keeping secrets. I did not know they would start reaching into our house." Helen's face had gone hard in a child's way. "You told him?" she said to Amarka. "You made a promise?" Amarka glanced at Jacob, and for a brief instant she looked younger than she was. "I thought it would help," she said. "I thought I could take it and run, and no one would follow. I thought—" Her voice broke, and she swallowed the rest. Jacob felt, for the first time, the house like a thing that had been built on borrowed trust. Everything he had wanted to be for Helen, father, protector, provider, seemed to be measured now in the currency of what they could hide. He had been certain that courage came later, that decisions could be postponed until there was a margin to breathe. The message in his pocket was a knife that made postponed things immediate. "Who is he?" Jacob demanded. Amarka's shoulders hunched as if under the weight of the answer. "He is not from here," she said. "He wears a jacket like a foreigner. He speaks with a careful English. He left a card. He asked that I come alone. He said he could help Helen if I agreed to a service." "What service?" Miriam asked. Her voice was not loud. It was the sort of quiet that warns of storms. Amarka looked at Jacob. He wanted assurances. He wanted to know I would not tell. He wanted a place where he could be untroubled. Jacob understood then, not by the words, but by the way they were said, that it was not a thing of purity, or the kind of transaction that could be numbered into sin and forgiveness neatly. It was the slow squeeze of poverty on a woman's choices. It was the arithmetic of rumor and survival. "So you let him come here?" Jacob's question was less an accusation than a mapping of facts. She nodded. "One afternoon, when you were at work, he left money in an envelope." "Envelope. I took it. I burned the rest." Her hands were small and work-roughened. She clasped them together like someone praying and not certain which God would answer. Jacob's first impulse was to pull the envelope from beneath Miriam's neat stacks and to look at the handwriting, the postmark, anything that might drag this thing into the light. But Helen reached out and stopped him with a child's hand on his sleeve. "Don't," she said. "Please." He looked down at the child who wanted nothing more than a school bag and a future, and wondered what was owed to her by the small mercies of adults. Miriam moved then, like a keeper of the old order. "You will tell him to stay away," she said to Amarka. "You will return the money if you can. You will not meet him again in this house." "And if he comes?" Jacob asked. Miriam's eyes, small and fierce, found the gate. "Then we make sure he never comes again. We send him away with nothing and with knowledge that this house is not for sale." Jacob swallowed. The narrative he preferred was one where violence was unnecessary. He would fight at the workbench. He would pick up odd jobs. He would make enough to keep shame and hunger at bay. But the city had a way of reading the best intentions as weakness. The man with the jacket might not accept words. "I should go," Jacob said finally. "I will find him. I will tell him to stop." Amarka's face went white. "You can't," she said. "He will watch you. He will know where to find you." "I'll be careful," Jacob said. The words had the brittle ring of a promise made without counsel. He left with a coat he had not intended to wear and a map of a nervous city in his head. Mariam watched him go, the thin line of her jaw drawn. Helen sat back at the table and smoothed the crumpled paper in her fist, as if smoothing a small future. Outside, Lagos returned to its ordinary violence. Motorbikes threaded between buses. Hawkers raised their voices like flags. Jacob walked with a purpose that kept breaking in half. Rage at the man who thought he could buy a life. Fear for the woman who had believed a promise sounded like safety. And a private shame at how little a man could do when the city ground options down to grains. In the lane he found the car with a foreign plate, waiting beneath a grease-streaked billboard. A man in a jacket that had seen better streets stepped from behind the wheel and gave Jacob a polite, measured smile, as if they were two men who had met to discuss business. "You're Jacob, yes?" the stranger asked in careful English. Jacob's hands found the hem of his coat. "Who are you?" he said. "Someone who wants to help," the man said. "Come, let us talk." Jacob thought of Helen's laugh, of the cup on the table, of the paper in his pocket. The city narrowed, and there was only the man with the jacket, the man with the envelopes, and the long, thin line between choice and consequence. He stepped forward. Inside the house, Amarka rinsed a cup and watched the water steady in the sink. Miriam folded the envelopes with hands that did not tremble. Helen went back upstairs and pressed her forehead against a window that looked down on a street that did not care for private tragedies. The plate of food sat untouched on the table, like a promise waiting to be made true. A motorbike passed, its riders singing out a name. The sound of it was ordinary, but everything inside the house felt like a vessel waiting to spill. Across the lane, two men sat in a car and smiled like men who had the power to rearrange a household. Jacob closed his eyes for a moment and understood that some cups, once lifted, cannot be set down without leaving a mark. He opened his eyes and crossed the street. The man in the jacket rose as if to greet him. The city moved around them, indifferent and immense, while a family in a small house waited for what would happen when words hardened into consequences. The man's smile thinned when Jacob did not move toward the car. He folded his hands as if folding a letter, careful and patient, like someone who had paid to see a scene unfold and expected it to go according to plan. "You came alone," he said, brave. Jacob's thumb found the crumpled paper in his pocket and turned it until the edges bit into his palm. He could feel the shape of a bank stamp beneath the fold, a neat loop of foreign ink. It was a small thing, a proof of intention. It was also a promise that someone in another city had seen Helen and thought to pay for silence. "Where is he?" Jacob asked. His voice did not shake, though it held all the quiet of the room at dawn before the market opened. The man glanced at the empty street, at the wall of traffic beyond. "He's busy," he said. "He pays. He doesn't stay long. Why would you want to make trouble? You can leave this with me. I can make it simple." Jacob pictured Helen's small hands, the way she smoothed a paper as if she could iron out a fate. He pictured Miriam folding the envelopes with a jaw like knotted rope. He pictured Amarka's face when Jacob had promised he would go. He had come to say stop. He had not come to barter. "This is not yours to take," Jacob said. He pushed his hand into his pocket harder and let the paper show, not in a theatrical flourish, but as evidence in the palm of a man who wanted credit for truth. The stranger's practiced smile flickered when he saw the stamp. "You're a stubborn one," the man murmured. He leaned a little closer, the scent of perfume and cheap tobacco meeting Jacob in the humid air. "You have options, Jacob. For a man like you, a little help goes far. For a family like yours, much farther." "You don't know us," Jacob said, "and you don't get to decide what goes far. You leave Helen alone." A muscle throbbed at the corner of the man's mouth. He seemed pleased, then bored, as if someone had given him an interesting toy and now wanted a new one. "You think you can protect them?" he asked softly. "You think the city listens to one man? Listen." A movement from the car made Jacob's teeth ache with foreknowledge. The man's hand slipped into his jacket pocket and came out with something that caught the light. Not a gleam of steel so much as the flat line of a business card and the shadow behind it. Jacob's heart tapped an alarm he could not name. "Don't," said a new voice close to Jacob's ear. It was not the man's voice. It was small and clean and entirely not a part of the negotiation. Jacob turned, and there was Helen at the curb, footwear in hand, her school bag slung at an angle that made her look 7½ and brave. She had left the house when the meal went cold and the silence lengthened. She had followed the promise she trusted into danger. The man's eyes widened in genuine surprise, delighted now at a twist. "Ah, the child." He gave a low, cultured laugh. "She is charming." Helen's lips trembled. She had the look of children who feel an adult shame in their bones, embarrassed for what the world knows. Jacob stepped between her and the stranger without thinking, hands open, palms visible. "Go home," he said to Helen. "Go now." Helen looked at him, then at the stranger, then at the open street where the city moved like a living thing that would not stop for anyone. She sank back, small and obedient, and began to walk toward home. Jacob kept his eyes on the man. "See," the man said, "you care. That makes you reasonable. That makes this easy. I'll leave you enough to sleep. You can keep your pride and your family." Jacob felt anger like a thin wire humming under his skin. It was not for the money. It was for what the money represented. Power bought and sold. The idea that a life could be rented for a night and then returned with a receipt. "You don't leave anything that matters," Jacob said. "You leave shame and debt. You leave a language for the city to use against us." The man's mouth hardened. He took a step forward, too close. "You are a small man playing at righteousness," he said. "You could make this very uncomfortable for your family." Jacob thought of Miriam's hands folding envelopes. He thought of Amarka washing a cup. He thought, absurdly, of the bench where he had learned to make a thing from nothing. There was something to be made here, he told himself, not with money, but with consequence. "You come back," Jacob said, "and I will tell the men at the market. I will tell the landlord. I will tell the others who watch the lanes. They will not like a man who brings trouble and expects their women to be quiet about it." The man's face flickered with annoyance. "Those men are small," he said, but the word did not carry certainty. "I have means you don't understand." Jacob smelled the city again, diesel and fish and the creosote scent of wood near the port, and made himself feel the limits of what he could do. He could not call police and expect justice. He could not buy protection. He could, however, make a nuisance of the man. And in Lagos, nuisances could grow teeth if they found the right mouths to chew on them. "You leave now," Jacob said. "You say my name in the market, and you will get an answer. Not money, not favors. You will get people who mind the reasons things stay whole. You will get notice." The stranger's jaw worked. He let out a soft, impatient sound, like someone trying not to be bothered by a fly. For a beat, he looked older, less smooth. Then he smiled and reached into his jacket again, this time drawing a folded note and flattening it in the palm of his hand with the deliberation of someone making an offer. "Take it," he said, "for the family, for me, and you will go about your life." Jacob looked at the money, clean, foreign, then at Helen, who had nearly reached the gate, and paused, watching like a small animal at the lip of water. Jacob could have taken it. He could have bought for a week and told himself it was a strategic surrender. He could have made the ache of possibility softer for Miriam's hands and for Helen's stomach. He thought of the small ritual in the kitchen, of Miriam burning the rest and holding back the urge to speak the whole name of shame. He thought of Amarka, furious and helpless. He thought of promises that could be kept only if they were kept now. Jacob put his hand over the money without touching it and said, quietly and in English that was not his first, "You go away. You do not come back. You find someone else." The man squinted, then laughed that low, polite laugh into the hush. He folded the note back into his wallet, as if folding up a map he no longer needed. "You are noble, Jacob. That will not feed them." "It will keep them," Jacob said, "from being owned." The man considered an hourglass of possible outcomes, and found boredom on the side of patience. He stepped back, palms up in the small universal sign of concession. "For now," he said, "for tonight. But understand, people's wants change. People are not like you. They repair what they want with different hands." He leaned toward Jacob as he turned, and in the movement was threat and the intimacy of a man who wanted to be remembered. "Watch your family," he said. "It's a pity when good people learn to be cruel." Then he was in the car, engine coughing to life, and the car slid away, unsteady among the other beasts of metal and horn. Jacob watched it go until the taillights blurred into the yellow smear of the street lanterns. He felt the city breathe out. At the gate, Helen hung back and then ran, as small people do when they understand they have been saved by something larger than they can name. She threw herself at Mariam's skirt and began to cry with the strange, cleansing mixture of release and fear. Mariam held her like a woman who had been practiced at holding things together. Amid the smell of dinner dying on the table, Jacob stood in the lane and felt the thin, dangerous lightness of a man who had done something and not yet paid for it. He had made a choice that might one day be counted as brave or foolish. He had placed himself between a stranger and his family and called the stranger's bluff. For the moment, the bluff held, like a cloth stretched tight. For the moment, the house remained theirs. Inside, Mariam's voice was steady as the way she folded the envelopes. "We will not leave," she said. "We will make this house a place he cannot buy." Amarka wiped her hands on her sarong and looked at Jacob with an expression that combined wrath and a tender, dangerous gratitude. "You should not have gone," she said. But the accusation was softer than the relief that followed. Jacob did not speak then. He felt the city settle again around them, the kind of peace that never lasted through the night. There would be men who asked questions, and men who answered with fists. There would be choices about moving, about hiding, about speaking to people who could turn a polite stranger into a story told in the market stall. There would be sleepless nights, and a ledger of small favors repaid. He looked at Helen, asleep with her head on Mariam's lap, at Amarka stirring the food back into life on the stove, and thought of the bench where his hands knew how to make things whole. He had one craft. He could make and mend, and he could work. He had one weapon. He could make sure the house was seen, known, and defended by the lives that passed it every day. "We tell them," he said at last, "to no one and to everyone. We tell the neighbors, the market men. We make the house loud." Mariam nodded. "We make the house loud," she agreed. Outside, beyond the small circle of their evening, Lagos carried on. A woman calling, a hawker selling plantain, a child who did not know how to keep fear at bay. The city was immense and indifferent, but in its indifference it also carried currents of solidarity, tiny human things that might bend the will of a man with a jacket if enough hands pressed. They would not sleep easily. They would plan, bargain, stand watch. They would make banners of their ordinary lives and hold them up for all to see. In a city that sometimes made ghosts of promises, that was how you kept a house from being stolen, by naming it, by making its life too visible to be quietly erased. Jacob stepped back inside with the smell of dust and petrol in his hair. The plate on the table was cold. He sat, and for a long time none of them spoke. Then Mariam reached across and took his hand, small, work-roughened fingers closing like a vow, and in that grip Jacob found a quiet answer he could live with. They would meet whatever came, not as individuals, but as a household, loud and marked and refusing to be bought. They kept watch that night, not with weapons, but with windows open, curtains drawn aside, so the street could see them moving, living. In the morning, Jacob would go to the market. He would speak to men with oil-dark hands and quick eyes. He would name the stranger. He would build his defense with rumor, with reputation, with the slow, stubborn work of a man whose life was scraped clean and then hammered into something that could be relied on. For now, he listened to Helen's even breathing and let the city's distant roar tuck him into a vigilance that was not sleep but not panic either. It was what he could afford, a readiness like a held breath. Outside, a motorbike cut through the dawn, its rider calling a name that belonged to other stories. The house made small noises, cup on table, floorboard settling, ordinary, stubborn sounds, like people deciding to endure. Jacob closed his eyes and waited for what would come next. Jacob left the lane with a small bundle of tools at his hip and the stubborn weight of the night's decision folded into his step. The market came awake like a mouth opening to speak, voices, the slap of wooden stalls, the hiss of frying oil. He walked past women balancing basins of tomatoes, past men unloading sacks of charcoal, and let the place pull him into its long memory of favors and deaths. He worked as he walked. At Sule's stall, he tightened a loose hinge on an old crate in exchange for a cup of tea and a name. "Heard it was a man in a jacket," Sule said, stirring his tea with a practiced impatience. "Came down from the mainland, looked like he paid in cash, said he had papers." The words came out like a warning more than information. Sule's eyes flicked away, toward the road as if the jacketed man might be listening in the early light. Jacob cleaned the hinge with the corner of his sleeve and thought of papers and jackets and the thin, theatrical authority of a man with money. He thanked Sule and moved on, circling the market the way a tradesman checks a machine for faults. He stopped at the barber's where old Musa was sweeping the floor, his voice a low radio of gossip and time. "You got a lot of courage," Musa said when Jacob explained, wiping his hands on his trousers. "Or a lot of nothing to lose." He spat a ribbon of tobacco and nodded toward the corridor leading to the bus stop. "He came in a taxi, paid for the whole back seat, told the driver not to ask and offer more money if anyone tried. Drivers like to listen, they know who rides and where." Musa thumbed the dust from a shelf and added, almost fondly, "He spoke like he was used to being obeyed. But even men like that, most times they are bluffing. They just want you to look smaller." Jacob left with a name this time. A driver had said the jacketed man gave the name Asa. It was not a name of the street, not one belonging to the stalls and the bench saws, but it could be repeated, shaped into rumor. Rumor, Jacob thought, was a kind of architecture. If you built it carefully, it kept people from walking into the space you wanted to protect. He went on to the fisher's corner, where men with salt-gray hair smoked as if to season themselves. He sat on a crate and with his hands helped mend a net while he spoke. "There's a house on Awolowo," he said quietly. "A man has come asking questions. Strange man, jacket. He sent someone by night, my family." The fisherman listened with the easy respect owed to a man who could fix something. "Tell it to the morning traders," one said. "Tell it to the pastor's wife. When a house becomes a story, whole crowds keep watch without thinking they do." They offered a spare radio battery and a promise that they would tell the woman who sells bread at the station. She had a niece who worked for a municipal office and could perhaps look into papers without asking aloud. Every exchange added grain to the structure Jacob wanted to raise. A driver who remembered the taxi, a hawker who had seen the jacketed man pay for petrol 2 streets over, a name, Asa, that could be repeated until it sounded like a fact. He moved through the market like someone collecting stones to place at the threshold of the house. Each stone was a neighbor who would look up if someone tried to move a sheet of paper across their path. By mid-morning, he had a loose net of allies. He arranged for 3 small things. Miriam's sister would spread the word at the laundromat. Amarka would go to the mosque after Friday prayer and ask the elders to keep an eye. Jacob himself would pick up a battered signboard from a carpenter friend and paint on it the family name and welcome hours, a blunt, visible claim. When he returned, the house smelled of stew again, this time thicker and full of the sound of women planning, as if planning could make danger lose its edges. Helen sat now at the table propped by pillows, awake and patient-eyed. She laughed, soft and surprised, when Jacob burst through with a crate of fruit and news. Miriam listened, folding and refolding the envelopes into a neat stack that was a small island of order. "Make it public," Jacob said. "Not loud in the way of shouting, but loud so that if anybody whispers about buying this place, they will meet a crowd like a wall. Open house, Sunday breakfast. People will come. We ask for names, and we keep the story on the street. If someone comes with papers, we have witnesses." Miriam's fingers paused. "You would have the neighbors in our yard?" she asked, not because the idea was strange, but because she was always careful to weigh the cost of generosity. "We would have them," Amarka said, looking up from where she was scraping the pan. "We will brew too much tea. We will ask Sule and Musa to bring someone. We will let it be seen." Her voice, when she decided, had the bluntness of the pots she cleaned. "If this house goes, it will be because people did not know it belonged to anyone." They wrote a scrap of paper and glued it with paste to the front window. "Breakfast, Sunday, all welcome." It was small resistance, a banner made of poverty and hope. But in the market tradesmen had taught Jacob to understand that the smallest mark, if repeated, could become a boundary. People recognized what was acknowledged. They hated a blank, uncertain space more than an occupied claim. That afternoon, as Jacob sanded the edges of the sign with a discipline that steadied him, a motorbike stuttered past the house and a man in a clean shirt slowed to stare. He was not the jacketed man. His clothes said he was someone who had learned how not to be noticed. His gaze lingered on the window where the paper hung. Jacob felt it as a physical touch, the way a person senses a presence before they speak. He straightened and watched. The bike did two things then. It turned, and the rider waved at a neighbor further down the lane. The wave was casual, but the lane, which had been a string of ordinary days, registered the gesture like a signal. People leaned out of windows. A boy up the corner stopped playing marbles. Jacob set the sign by the doorway and carried on with other small measures, shutting loose shutters with new screws, tucking a coil of rope behind the stairs, leaving a lamp burning on the porch at night. These were not weapons. They were habits that announced occupancy. They were the sort of work he knew how to perform, and that seemed to accrue to the household a kind of invincibility measured in mundane rituals. When night came, voices gathered in the warm dark outside their gate. Not threatening voices, but a string of neighbors who stopped simply to tell what they had seen that day, to ask if they could bring chairs on Sunday, to volunteer a kettle. Miriam stood in the doorway as people talked. Her hand found Jacob's and squeezed, a small, fierce thing. On a bench 2 houses down, someone hummed an old hymn under his breath, the tune thin and stubborn. It was the kind of neighborhood sound that makes a place feel like it belongs to people rather than to profit. Jacob listened to it, to the weave of belonging growing tighter with every voice, and thought that the house might yet survive on the weight of other people's presence. He had not yet guessed the full shape of what would come. Men in suits, threats whispered through intermediaries, or the patience of papers. But the first measure had begun. They had made the house visible, named loud. That night, with the street murmuring and Helen's breath like a small tide across the room, Jacob felt the house tilt not toward fear, but toward something else, a quiet, collective refusal. Before he slept, Miriam handed him the last envelope she had set aside, its edges blank except for a single line of the name she had written days ago. Jacob read it by the lamplight, Asa. He folded it into his pocket and lay awake, listening to the lane breathe and to the city roll with business and watchfulness. He felt, like a craft he was accustomed to, an arrangement of small parts holding against a larger force. Outside, someone laughed softly at a story. A motorbike grumbled in the distance. The house made its stubborn noises, a broom settling in a corner, a saucepan cooling, and Jacob waited for what would come next. He did not feel unprepared. He felt instead that he had begun to build something that, if it could not stop everything, could at least demand to be seen. The next morning, he planned, he would speak to the pastor, to Musa, to Sule. He would put a man on the corner to keep watch at dawn. For now, he closed his eyes and let the city, large and indifferent, and also strangely generous, hold them in its long, uneven hand. Somewhere along the lane, a child called out a name, and the sound landed in the house like a small promise.